Hello, hello, Edson Oliveira here. This is a SoloCoder Podcast where I have hopefully interesting conversations with coders, developers, programmers. Call them however you want. But they have one thing in common, they have the passion for coding, for programming as a big part of their lives, as a big part of who they are. And today is no different. Today I have Jon Skeet with me. Jon, welcome. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. My name's Jon Skeet. I'm a 40-something-year-old developer, primarily in C#, both for personal and work reasons. I work for Google, producing the Google Cloud client libraries for .NET, and do a bunch of other fun stuff in terms of development. And I'm probably, if the listeners have heard of me at all, and if you haven't, hey, if you've heard of me at all, it's probably for Stack Overflow, where I'm the top ranking or top reputation contributor. And I've also written a few books on C# as well.
You know, Jon, I'm pretty sure that my students have seen you, even if they don't recognize the name, but with their searches on Google, looking for things about C#, where to find things, how to fix this, how to fix that, I'm quite sure that they came across your name on Stack Overflow, you know?
Yeah, quite possibly, quite possibly.
Okay, Jon, so I usually like to start with my guests from the origin stories. And I invited you today with the goal of exploring Stack Overflow and your relationship with Stack Overflow and your history with Stack Overflow, but I'm quite sure that things did not start for you on Stack Overflow. From what I read, before Stack Overflow, you had a 10 years history of contributing to news groups. So take me back to the beginning when you started to answer questions on news groups, and tell me about that. Tell me about that beginning history there.
So that beginning was actually when I started at university, and the university computer room was upgraded, in fact, during my first year. So for the first term of university, our college computer room had about 10 computers and they were just text. So didn't get to do very much. And the web was really in its infancy. So I was using a web browser called Lynx, which was text only. And when the new computer room was launched with 40 or 50 machines, some Mac, some Windows, I don't think we had, I'm not sure whether Linux was a thing at the time. This was 1994. I can't remember my Linux history. So first got into Mosaic and things, but I started with news groups when I started learning Java, which was very, very new at the time. I think I started learning Java before it hit 1.0, so one of the late betas, and fairly quickly found the Complang Java programming news group. Basically, when I was in university, there were two news groups that I was in all the time. One was Complang Java Programmer, and the other was Altbook Stephen King, which my first websites were all about Stephen King, loads of books, loads of posts about Stephen King. But I also posted quite a bit on the Complang Java Programmer news group as I was learning. And I don't remember much about those first few years, other than one really interesting thing about the newsreader. So the program that I was using back when it wasn't that you used a web browser for absolutely everything. I used a program called TRN, which was Threaded Read News. And beyond when I was in college computer rooms, eventually we all got Ethernet in our rooms, and I had a really old hacky machine bolted together from various things running Linux with a very small monitor, and it was not the world's best computer, but it was able to run TRN really easily because that's just text, because Usenet was just text. There were various binaries that you could download or whatever, but they were all converted from base64 or whatever. I was only interested in the text. But the interesting thing about TRN is when you were going to post almost anything, whether it's starting a thread or replying to someone, it said, be warned, your post is going to go to possibly thousands of people. This is going to cost thousands of dollars for someone sooner or later, because the internet, may be free to you, but is not free to everything. So are you sure you really want to do this? Are you aware of the cost? And it just made me value communication and think to myself, if I'm going to write something, I don't want to write me too. I don't want to write, lol, that sounds fun or something. I want to do something meaningful, whether it's asking a question that means something to me or writing a reply that means something to me. So I'm going to put some time into that. Now, I don't think I thought of it as consciously back then, but looking back now, I think that was the start of me really thinking that you need to put time into communications and effort into it, that doing the bare minimum is really not good enough, not in terms of computer programming or anything, but just as a human being. Like, if you are asking a question on Stack Overflow and you decide that all you can be bothered to do is take a photo of your homework assignment and post that as an image, like, what does that say to anyone else about how much effort you are putting in versus what you're expecting to get out of anyone else? So there's thinking about the sort of relationships and communication online and how much effort you put in. So I think that sort of started me down a good road of caring about what I write, that has proved very useful, not just in terms of online communications. And I sound very high and mighty and like everything I write is pristine and beautiful and I never make any typos, never make any spelling mistakes, take hours over every post. And that's obviously not true. But it speaks to a little of valuing or understanding that if I put more time in, it will probably make people more inclined to help me or read, take on board what I'm saying, etc. There's a value in taking the time to do things properly.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. Let me dig a little bit deeper there. So, and I know that this was many, many years ago. Memory might be a little bit blurry from what happened back then, but I can only imagine that the initial motivation was, I have this problem, maybe I need to ask this question, let's see if anyone is going to reply to this question. And then at some point, or maybe in parallel to that, you felt the need to start answering as well, because I'll tell you this, as you know, majority of the users, if we look at Stack Overflow, they are consuming content. They are searching, they are searching Google, ending up on Stack Overflow, and they don't necessarily bother answering questions or even asking. They find an answer there, they go a little bit deeper there, but that's it. They stay right there.
Right.
What do you think motivated you to go one step below that? I'm not gonna just ask. I'm gonna start to see, can I contribute here as well? See if you can reconnect a little bit of that desire,
And before I do, I just want to say, anyone who is getting the answers they need by searching on Stack Overflow, that is absolutely fine. There is no moral judgment associated with I never post at all, I haven't even got an account kind of thing. That's absolutely fine. That's the expectation. That's the system working properly. And people who say, oh, well, I'm not really confident, I only ever ask questions, I don't answer anything, you're still doing a valuable service to the community, particularly if you put time into asking questions and researching beforehand, etc. You are doing actually more valuable work, because there are fewer good questions on Stack Overflow than good answers, or fewer people writing good questions than people writing good answers. However, I will come back to what you asked. So I think I'm a naturally, I was going to say I'm a naturally chatty person. And somehow that does happen on podcast recordings, but it doesn't typically happen in real life. I'm definitely an introvert. So I find like going to a party where I don't know anyone is a nightmare situation for me.
Very taxing. Very taxing.
Very taxing. Yes, it really drains me. Large meetings drain me. Talking with close friends, not a problem at all. And bizarrely speaking, standing up in front of 100 people and giving a talk on something I know about, not a problem. Love doing it. And this comes back to, why was I answering questions? Why was I even asking them? And I should also mention that as well as writing on Stack Overflow and doing computery things, I'm a committed Christian and actually a Methodist local preacher. So my sort of public speaking skills, such as they are honed both in terms of what I do at church as well as what I do in user groups and conferences. And I think very, very few people, there are a couple of people in the world who have seen me preach and seen me at a conference, and I would love to talk to them at some point and say, what's the same and what's different? So there's something probably that I shouldn't be terribly proud of in terms of, I like talking, I like demonstrating knowledge. Obviously, you can put it more charitably as I like helping people. And yes, I do. But I do enjoy hey, I've got this great idea. I want everyone else to hear it.
But this is you today. Do you think that you had that same mindset, 30 years ago when we were talking about that?
I think I had at least the seed of that mindset. I had the, hey, someone's posted a question and I can answer it. So I'm darn well going to. If I know something that will help someone, or maybe back in Usenet was much less strictly question and answer than Stack Overflow. It was much more discussions. And I have always been strong-willed, firm in my opinions, which have changed over time, but I've been fairly firm in them. So yes, I've always been happy to engage in debate, and I think I got started in Compline Java Programmer more in terms of discussion than simple question and answer. So they served somewhat different purposes. So yeah, I think that probably is something to do with how I was brought up. My family environment, we were always happy to discuss things. I remember sitting around the dinner table and my dad asking me and my brother was doing physics, what would determine the diameter of a rainbow. When you see a rainbow in the sky, you see it supposedly, from place X to place Y. What determines that diameter? Is it how fast it's raining, the size of the raindrops, the angle of the sun? What does this sort of thing? And we were discussing all these things. So the dinner table was never a quiet place in our household. Lots of vigorous debate. It was great. And I think that set me up for, express yourself online as well. And I always tried to express myself in a very transparent way. Back in late 90s, someone said to me, hey, you're one of the only people who is exactly the same online as you are in real life. They'd known me online for ages and then met me and said, you're exactly the same. I don't understand what's going on. Everyone else is sort of putting on a facade of some description or whatever.
I get it.
I think there's probably a bit less facade these days, at least when you go beyond the sort of Instagram, oh, everything in my life is wonderful or everything in my life is terrible. But if you're chatting with people on Zoom, for example, it's somewhat harder to have very much of a facade. Or if you do, you can do the same thing in real life and pretend that everything's okay when it's not.
Awesome. Okay. So thank you for the initial story there of how things started, you contributing, going out there. Back then, I would say that the term at least that I used to use was user groups and things like that. Today it's meetups and things changed a little bit there. But then you were talking about the mid-90s, and then let's try to fast forward a little bit to 2008. From my research, 2008 seems to have been a big turning year for you. And I'm going to list a few things, just so you know that I did my homework. 2008, you got hired by Google. 2008, Stack Overflow was created. 2008, you started contributing to Stack Overflow. 2008, you got your first book published, the first edition of C Sharp in depth. So
Yes.
tell me about 2008.
So obviously I've been writing C Sharp in depth for a bit longer than that. And in fact, I think the job that I did before before Google, um, when I was interviewed there, I just got my contract for writing C Sharp in depth. And when I joined Google, back then at least, when you join Google, you go to Mountain View in California, for a couple of weeks of Noogler orientation. And I don't know whether they fly people out these days, but it was really interesting. And when I got home, the first edition of C Sharp in depth was on my doorstep. So actually thinking about that given that was only 11 months or so, I'm quite surprised that it was as fast as it was. There may have been, I may be slightly off in some of my recollection of the starting point, but I do remember coming home and new job, and hey, the books are on my doorstep. So that was very, very cool. That was May 2008. And I think that's quite possibly the same month that Stack Overflow was starting, but I didn't actually hear about it until I think it was September, which ended up being due to Sarah Chips, who then went on to work at Stack Overflow. It's a very small world. She'd written a blog post about C Sharp in depth, and I think possibly her following blog post was about Stack Overflow. So I thought, oh, I'll visit Stack Overflow, see if anyone's asking questions about C Sharp in depth, and found a couple of other questions on C Sharp and answered those. And I think it was either that day or the day after I wrote a blog post saying, I think I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on Stack Overflow. I had no idea just how much.
So I have one question about Google and C Sharp. Let's get this one out of the way. So
Yeah.
when I saw you working at Google but work with C Sharp, to me that was a kind of a paradoxical type of combination, because you are working with Microsoft technology inside Google. So just unpack this a little bit for us.
Sure. So this is quite a fun story, actually. So I started at Google working in Java, and worked in Java for, other than a small break to write the Windows Phone Google app in C Sharp. Other than that, I was basically working in Java for the first, probably nearly 10 years that I was at Google, 8 or 9 years. And I had noticed I'd always bounced between C Sharp and Java for professional, for coding at work. But I'd noticed that when I was coding in Java, I would still post on Compline Java Programmer and still keep up with what was going on in Java, but also keep up with what was going on in C Sharp and be active in the C Sharp community. When I was working in C Sharp, I kind of dropped the Java community bit. I wasn't as interested. It didn't grab me, and I wasn't writing Java at home in personal projects, whereas I was always writing C Sharp in personal projects, after 2003 or so. So I was hired by Google to write Java, and that was all fine. And Java has certainly, the speed of iteration of Java seems to have improved. I haven't kept a very close eye on it, but it's interesting just how many features seem quite similar to C Sharp. There's records now. I don't know what the Java async support is like these days, but there's been quite a lot of overlap. And it's not like I'm saying, oh, C Sharp invents everything. C Sharp's borrowed loads from F Sharp. That's the way of things. It's a good thing. But I was writing Java for most of the time at Google for a long time, other than I had what's called a 20% project, which was to implement protocol buffers in C Sharp. So 20% projects are projects which you sort of kind of need manager approval. I think it depends on exactly where you are within your career at Google, and whether you've got to be able to do your main job, but the expectation is there should be enough wiggle room that you can do other interesting things that are at least tangentially beneficial to Google. And when I joined Google, started working with protocol buffers, which were at the time Google's internal only serialization framework and wire format and all the tools, and we have a lot of internal tools. And then Protobuf was open sourced. So the wire format became open, the Java code, C++, this was before Go existed as a language, but C++, Java, and probably Python, right, that's there. So I thought, well, it would be really good if we could use protocol buffers from C#. So I will do that as my 20% project. And I thoroughly enjoyed doing that. Usually worked from home when I spent a day doing protocol buffers. And these days I work from home all the time. So even then I was doing C# stuff for some of the time. These days, working with protocol buffers in C#, not just working with, because they're what all the Google APIs are based on, but also I'm now an official maintainer for protocol buffers in C#. I'm sort of the lead, sounds too grand a term, but I'm the person that they come to if something needs implementing, or if someone in the community has created a pull request, it gets punted to me. I'm not actually on the protocol buffers team, but I'm very close friends with them, and it's known that I maintain the C# side of things. So Protobuf has been a sort of long line in my Google history, and it does mean that probably I don't know all of the protocol buffers team personally or well, but it's possible that I've been working on protobufs longer than any of them have, just because I've been doing it right from when it was open source. I'm sure there are other people in Google who've been doing bits and pieces in the background on them for many years before I even joined. So that's how I sort of did a bit of C# at Google, but then about 5 or 6 years ago, and I haven't looked at the timeline recently, although if you look at the repository history for the Google APIs / Google Cloud.net repository, you probably find the first commit there to get the history. I started getting more interested in API design, and there was a new API platform coming out within Google with the intention that another of our technologies for RPCs was not being open source directly, but there was going to be an open source version that became gRPC. So our new RPC platform based on gRPC and protobufs, and obviously I wanted to be able to talk to this via C#, was interested in what the gRPC team was doing in C#, interested in the API design. There were aspects of the API design around how do we represent timestamps in a sensible manner? How do we represent date and time, and proto-based design that fit in with my niche of date and time interesting aspects. And so I gravitated towards that and became part of the Cloud.net team right from the start, with a good friend of mine, Chris Sells, who was previously at Microsoft, and who I'd met at the NDC conference in Norway back in, I think it was in 2010, and we'd gone out and bought a fruit bowl in the market in Oslo the night before, so that I could, when I was giving a talk about generics, and I could talk about, a bunch of bananas is not the same as a fruit bowl. Which is why list of banana isn't a list of fruit. You know that a list of bananas only has only has bananas, and you could potentially add a banana to a bunch of bananas. You can't add an apple to a bunch of bananas, but you can add an apple to a fruit bowl. Anyway, so Chris was used to me and was forming this .NET team, and so obviously I leapt at the chance, worked with fantastic folks, most of whom have moved on to other things. The .NET side of things has been a slower turnover than probably any other language in the .NET libraries ecosystem, but I think I'm the only one right from the start. But I've worked with fantastic people.
That's awesome. That's great. Okay, awesome. So that explains a lot of why in Google, but working with C#.
Yeah.
Let's connect back 2008, beginning of Stack Overflow. You're beginning with Stack Overflow as well, Actually,
Hmm.
if my research is correct, you started with Stack Overflow the same month that it was created, around September 2008.
That's when it went sort of came out of beta.
I
I,
get it.
I
Okay.
wasn't in the beta program, so the
Okay.
beta badge is one I will never get.
Okay. Okay. That's the only one, I guess. Great. So tell me a little bit of the beginnings, if there is any, if it was just run of the mill, checking there are some questions that you know the answers, you just answer them. And is it how it goes by? Is it just what you used to do, or maybe what you still do? Because I still see you answering a lot of questions there. So tell me about the beginnings there, if your memory is, if you can
Hmm.
recollect that. 2008, beginning
Absolutely.
of Stack Overflow.
So importantly, back then, my day included a commute to London by bus and train, and that gave me a fair amount of time with a network connection via a sort of Wi-Fi dongle thing, mobile signal dongle. So I used to answer questions on the train, and also in work time. I've always used Stack Overflow in work time, um, on the grounds that so long as I'm getting enough work done and putting enough time into my work, my manager doesn't care whether I answer a Stack Overflow at 5:25 in the evening and then do some work from 5:30 till 5:35 or the other way around. Who cares? So long as I get my work done, it's fine. Back in 2008, I answered a lot of questions, and for the first few years of Stack Overflow, um, I would usually, by the time I had breakfast at work, I'd have answered 10 questions. Um, that doesn't happen these days. So I probably answer a question maybe once a day, maybe two or three on a good day, but much more of the time I'm adding comments to encourage people to improve their questions. And I don't know whether that's because I've become more picky or people have become, less as it gets more widespread. Um, the quality bar has gone down a bit, or just early on there were lots of questions that hadn't been asked. Now a lot of them have been asked. So if there's a certain amount of a gold rush to start with, saying, oh, right, we're in, it's greenfield project territory. Any question you ask is going to be new. Ask it well, and it will be viewed by millions of people over the years. These days, a lot of the time, people do ask questions that can immediately be closed as duplicates of something else, which sometimes they find difficult. But so long as the original question answers, the answers on the original question answer what their question would have been, then it's better for the site for the duplicate to be closed. So I think it is harder to naturally encounter things that haven't been asked on Stack Overflow. I do also think it gets used for people lazily not doing their homework more than it did back in 2008. But I answered a lot of questions back then. It's possible that if I looked at the same questions now, I would ask for more clarification before answering instead. I don't know. Uh, I'm certainly, if I look back at my first 100 or my first 1,000 posts, I suspect I wouldn't be terribly happy with some of the quality of, well, you were asking for clarification there. That should have been in comments instead of in as an answer. Oh yeah, but you gave a kind of an expected answer as well. I don't know. Things I possibly should have closed as duplicates. I'm sure I would pick up on myself. But yeah, I found a lot to answer and just did it and really enjoyed it. And largely the communication skills that I've been building up on Usenet, on newsgroups, then transferred over really quite easily, but with Markdown that let me format things and preview that. It was so much better than I'd always resisted previous forums using BB Edit or whatever it was called. Couldn't stand that. I guess it's still just a Markdown kind of thing, but Markdown felt really productive. And the fact that you could see a preview, like split screen preview, made all the difference. And the fact that the Stack Overflow user interface is very similar. I'm not trying to do down the great work of the Stack Overflow devs, but if you looked at Stack Overflow in 2008 and Stack Overflow in 2023, you would say, yeah, these are the same site. This is clearly, there have been improvements, definitely, but the bones of it were there right from the very start, or at least right from the post-beta start. And that hooked me in. It just felt really productive in a way that no other web forum ever had.
Okay, so I would say that if I put myself in the shoes of a student of mine, or maybe someone that is not actively helping people out there, whether it's educating or answering their questions, they would look at what you were talking about, and they would again question, why is he doing that? I mean, and you mentioned about the fact that you had this conversation in family, and maybe this need to socialize as well, and that was a tool for you. But again, what keeps you going and answering those questions? I mean, do you have, it's just the pleasure of doing that and being able to help another
really
human being? Is that it?
I don't think that's all of it. There are lots of pleasurable things in life. I think the fact that I know it helps people, and not just the person whose question I'm answering, but future generations, as it were. I think that is a significant part of it. I think I would be a fairly lousy in-person teacher, at a school at least. I would have no chance of keeping discipline or anything. There's just an area that I'm rubbish at. But the actual communicating of knowledge, I think I am quite good at. I think I can see where other people are coming from, rather than just impart the same information in the same way to everyone. No, you see that someone, one person is asking using all the language from the specification. They clearly basically know the details, and they're interested in one aspect that's not working the same way that they expected it to. Whereas someone else could be starting with the same code and puzzled about the same thing, but be coming at it from, well, I started writing C# today. I have no idea how this is working. And the way that you communicate with those two people is completely different. Do you start using more analogies? Do you give lots of examples? Do you try to reduce it to, well, in both cases, I think you try to reduce it to a minimal example that only talks about this particular bit that's causing a problem. But you definitely tailor it, whilst on Stack Overflow at least being aware that this isn't just for that one person. You're trying to put yourself in the shoes of people who will read it later, and you kind of expect, well, if someone has made it through a very technically detailed question, they are probably reasonably technically detailed, so it's okay, but I won't shoehorn it specifically for just that one person. And likewise, if someone is more of a beginner, then hopefully they will be able to follow an answer that is more tailored to beginners like themselves.
Awesome. Okay, so let me just preamble my next question with the fact that, and I didn't put that clearly out there, you mentioned that, but I want to highlight the fact that you are one of the, I would say, top 3 contributors of Stack Overflow of all time, even if you look back last month or the entire 14 years of Stack Overflow. Just wanted to make this addendum here, and so that I can mention the next thing, because the next sentence, because I don't think, when I think of an expert person that has so much contribution on Stack Overflow, from our conversation right now, you don't come across as that profile, and I'm going to explain a little bit better. I tend to think that the bigger contributors there, and I might be completely wrong, and that's just my bias here, that they are, let me summarize. they are not as friendly as you are. You are super friendly guy. I mean, you accept my invitation for this conversation very, very enthusiastically. Let me articulate a question here. Why is that Stack Overflow has this how would I describe that? It's this persona that people there are a little bit. You can think of aggressive. You can think of a little bit rude or rough, or they don't measure words in. Yeah. So try to articulate an answer to my badly formatted question here.
I'll put it more bluntly. Stack Overflow has a reputation amongst some people as being a pretty toxic environment. And I have a foot in two camps here. I see some aspects where people are genuinely rude. So someone comes in and someone else answers them in a rude way or comments in a rude way. And I will always flag that, saying, no, that's not on. I also see a lot of people post on Stack Overflow without paying due respect to the fact that they're asking for other people's time. And that's not a matter of, it's really important to say, that's not a matter of deference. It's not saying, oh, you think you're much better than me. It's, I'm another person. Like, don't waste other people's time. It's not a matter of whether they're better than you or worse than you. You don't waste people's time. So if someone does post a photo of their homework assignment, that's pretty rude as far as I'm concerned. And I see that a lot more often than the regular contributors on Stack Overflow posting rude things. Now, other people looking at Stack Overflow just occasionally or via searches may well not see that as much. And there's a reason for that, which is the bad posts, the bad questions tend to get closed, downvoted, deleted really quickly. So you don't see the bad actors on that side. So whereas you will still see some of the, oh, this question was closed annoyingly. And there are loads of blog posts with people saying, oh, every question I post gets downvoted mercilessly. It's impossible to post a question. I don't think it is. And I also don't think, I want to be clear, I don't think that everyone who posts a not very good question is lazy. Some definitely are. Some are just taking the mickey. But I do think there is a significant skills shortage in terms of taking a step back and how do you diagnose and then communicate a problem? And this is something that I've been wanting. I'll digress for just a minute. I want to, you may have noticed that every time you ask a question that takes 20 seconds to ask, I take 5 minutes to answer.
That's all good.
So there's a book that I have sort of started writing and tried writing, and eventually I will get it done. And the good news is it doesn't depend on the latest technology or anything, which is how do you diagnose problems? How do you make the next step forward? How do you, and it's more than just debugging. It's a way of thinking about things and reducing, playing divide and conquer, saying I've got 1,000 lines of code and the problem is probably somewhere in it. Well, is it in the first 500? How can I find out whether it's in the first 500 or the second 500? Can I get it down to 10 lines of code and demonstrate that with something that doesn't include anything that's sensitive to my company, etc.? If I can post something on Stack Overflow that is, here's 10 lines of code, I want it to do X, it's actually doing Y. Questions like that are almost never closed unless they're a duplicate of something else. And even so, actually, quite often, because that's such an inviting question to answer, people will answer it when possibly we should close them as duplicates. But that process of how you go from, something's wrong, I've no idea what, like, you'll get people asking questions and tagging it SQL Server, ASP.NET Core, JSON, and what they're asking about has nothing to do with any of those things. You can demonstrate it in a 10-line console application, And I love console applications because I don't need to start a web browser to do it. I don't need to start a web server, don't need to get on a mobile device, etc. Console apps are where it's at. Easy to debug, everything. You can demonstrate that for most questions, unless it's actually about the web framework that you happen to be using, etc. If you can teach your students to love console apps, then that's like half your job is done. Because if they don't get the information from you, they can find it out some other way. And that's learning how to learn is much more important than the facts that you learn along the way, because there will always be the next fact that you need. And if you don't know how to get it without bothering someone in person or asking a question that starts off being really vague or has thousands of lines of code, you're not going to get nearly as far. Whereas if you can dive in, and then the next half is, okay, so you've done the diagnostics, you have a much better idea of where it is. How do you communicate that with someone else? Communication is so key to all of this. And that skills shortage, I think, is what causes the toxicity or the reputation for toxicity, because if someone doesn't know that they haven't applied this diagnostic process to narrow it down, if they think that Stack Overflow is more like a help desk or a forum, and again, there's a certain amount of due diligence here. If you're going to post somewhere and you start off being given the tour, well, don't just click through and think, oh, I don't need to know all that. You do. That's the rules of the road. You don't go into a bar and immediately say, right, I want to play darts. It's like, but this is a bar at a bowling alley. Look around. I don't want to make too light of it, because I really dislike the fact that people have these bad experiences and come away hurt. And I don't want anyone to feel hurt. I do want people to do the work before they ask a question, but it's not in my interest for anyone to go away feeling worse about themselves or that everyone on Stack Overflow is a jerk. But it's sort of, your question makes me sad that your expectations would be that good top contributors are not all friendly. And I suspect that everyone who's in the 100,000 plus reputation, you don't get there without spending huge amounts of time helping other people. And you don't spend huge amounts of time helping other people if you don't like helping other people. If you're someone who just wants to belittle someone, you're not actually going to get very far on Stack Overflow. You might get to 10,000 rep or something, but you're not going to be really near the top.
Let me follow up with something here, Jon, that maybe without us opening Stack Overflow right now and going through the best practices and all of that, if someone comes to you and just asks, Jon, what is Stack Overflow good for? And what is it not good for, that you should not come with this kind of question here?
Okay, so it is very good for, I've run into a problem, I've done as much as I can to work out what's going on, but I'm just stuck. That's great. You've done work. You'll have found out loads of stuff when doing that work. If you follow, there's a link I can give you later on to a blog post I wrote back in, I think, 2010, maybe 2012, I gave it an unfortunate title of writing the perfect question. We're not looking for perfect. That was a big mistake on my part. Writing a good question on Stack Overflow. And it takes 10 minutes just to read the blog post. And actually writing a question on Stack Overflow, when I write a question, I've written a couple of questions in the last 6 months or so. And in each case, it took me at least an hour. And I learned more stuff while I was writing the question, while I was really, really narrowing it down. Oh, God, that's weird. Okay, yeah. And found, in one of the cases, it turned out to be my graphics driver had some problem with it, and in another case it was Windows behaves weirdly with UDP connections bolt. So it's these weird things, but because I was able to say, right, here's how you can reproduce it, someone said, well, I've tried that and it doesn't reproduce the problem. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, I'll try it on another machine. No, it only happens on one of my machines, and I can keep building up, I hadn't even thought to try it on a different machine because you don't expect it to be a problem with the graphics driver. So that's the kind of problem that is good. Things that aren't good for, that Stack Overflow isn't good for, is discussion. It's really not what's the best way of doing, can you give me pros and cons?
Opinions. Is that about opinions, correct?
Yeah. And obviously there are grey areas, that it's not like every question has exactly one answer that is the only correct answer, and but try to stay away from opinion-based things. It's just not designed for that. There are plenty of other places to go. Stack Overflow doesn't have to be the only place you ever use. It's also not good for finding resources. You don't say, I need a tool that will let me do X. Those questions are just off topic. It's also not the right place. And I would say this is partly a moral thing as well as partly just not useful. It's not a place to just post your homework. Posting your homework after you've started with your homework, you've got it down to, I've got most of this working, this one edge case isn't working, and I don't understand why my code is behaving this way. That's a perfectly good Stack Overflow question. But it's not a code writing service.
I get it.
It's a tool for helping you get over that one hump after you've done a load of work and before you do a load more work, probably.
Got it. Okay, so Jon, just to be cognizant with your time here, so we are getting towards, it's almost 10 minutes to the top of the hour, So again, I don't want to stretch your goodwill there, but can we go another 10 minutes there just to, because I'd like to try to extract next some stories,
Sure.
When you look back at those 14 years at Stack Overflow, contributing to Stack Overflow, can you remember any? It can be something that was very unique or that was unusual that happened, maybe an interaction with some other community members, maybe a positive one, maybe a negative one, however it is. But does anything comes to mind when you think about this trajectory there?
So I guess the answer that I've written that's got the most upvotes, and if I just switch to Stack Overflow briefly, it shouldn't take me long to find how many upvotes it's got now. And you're meant to upvote an answer if you find it useful. Whereas the question that has over 11,700 upvotes, the answer has that many, is something that I suspect hardly anyone has actually been helped by, other than, well, it's kind of interesting stuff, which is, why is subtracting these 2 times in 1927 giving a strange result? And the question doesn't talk about time zones, but I knew that I worked out that it would be about time zones, and there was an interesting time zone change in Shanghai in 1927. So a lot of time zones have sort of one odd change that might be 11 minutes or something like that, and then they go on to sort of more regular modern timing. And it so happened that this was in 1927 in Shanghai. So I find it kind of amusing that that's supposedly my most helpful answer. I don't think it actually is. I think people will have been helped by other answers. One that I'm proud of is I put time into writing out the difference between an object, a variable, and a reference, because they're often, we kind of talk about them in the same ways. And if I've got this variable X, I'll talk about passing X, and I mean passing the current value of X to a method. But we tend not to be terribly picky about how we talk about things. And if you don't understand the difference between those things, life goes horribly wrong. I'm sure you've come across the problems of, well, I'm passing a reference by value to this method versus I'm passing a value type variable by reference. Those are such different things. And then there's reference type by reference and all kinds of things. So we tend not to be terribly precise. I took some time to write an answer about that. I've written blog posts about that and things as well. And my guess is that's actually helped more people than subtracting 2 times in 1927 in Shanghai. But there have been various times, not so much recently, to be honest. It's been a while since I've spent an hour answering a single Stack Overflow question. But that used to happen, not terribly infrequently. And I would always learn myself when doing this. And that's one of the joys. I'm kicking myself now that you were saying, why do you do this? I talked about helping people and talked about it's just pleasurable. I learn from it all the time. I learn facts and I learn communication. And both of those are really useful. I've often written an answer for something and then a year later done a search because I'm stuck, or not necessarily massively stuck, but finding a Stack Overflow answer will be quicker than working it all out from scratch. And I find this answer and I think, oh, yeah, that does it. That's a very familiar writing style. Oh, yes, that's one of my answers.
That's what I was gonna ask. I mean, have you searched something, even Google, and you end up finding the answer? I mean, you provide the answer to that question.
Hundreds of times, yes.
Also, okay, let me ask you this. So again, 14 years with Stack Overflow, a lot of experience there. Do you feel that you helped somehow to shape what Stack Overflow became? I mean, for example, how close were you from Jeff Atwood and Joe Spolsky? I mean, have you been in touch with them? How was there?
I've met them. So one of the really interesting things was Stack Overflow did Stack Overflow Dev Days, did a series of one-day free conferences or near free conferences back in 2009, I think. And I presented Humanity Epic Fail, which is a talk I've given several times since at Dev Days, basically how humankind has messed up dates and numbers and text. And those are kind of the 3 fundamental aspects of data. If we get those wrong, we're in real trouble. But we have, as humans in general, we've invented all kinds of difficult aspects for ourselves. And then architects, creating frameworks and doing computer science have given us floating point numbers that no one really understands properly. And yes, people do understand them properly, but a lot of people don't. I kind of understand them. And then there's Unicode and, byte order marks and surrogate pairs and all kinds of really difficult aspects of Unicode. And then dates and times is just a whole, well, I do whole talks on dates and times frequently. So all of these things, they sound so simple and then they're hugely complicated. So I gave that talk in London and Joel was there, Jeff was there. I've met them before at other things. I didn't know them. I'd heard of both of them a bit before Stack Overflow started, but not significantly, and they certainly hadn't heard of me. But I would like to hope that I've shaped Stack Overflow to some extent in terms of trying to dampen down toxicity. I'm very clear that if I think a question is bad, I will vote to close it. Doesn't mean that the person is bad. Sometimes it happens that they have been lazy, and I will hopefully kindly say, you need to put some more effort into that. This kind of question isn't appropriate. Please put some more time into asking the question. Well, here's a resource that can help you, hopefully encouraging them. I have no evidence and very little real idea of how much difference, if any, my personal attitude to Stack Overflow has made a difference to the site as in general. I've posted 38,000 answers or something like that. There are however many million answers. I'm only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that. But I am, for better or worse, more prominent. I don't think I'm ever seen as a spokesperson for Stack Overflow, but people do associate what I say with Stack Overflow, the site, to some extent. So, yeah, to whatever extent I've managed to keep things slightly more friendly, that's all good.
Got it. I would have, I'd say, thought, just, I may even cut this out from the final, but I would have thought that, for top contributors, there could be some insider thing that you could voice things to them directly, and they could listen potentially better for your voice as compared to someone that is posted for the first time today.
Right. So there's definitely aspects of that, and I was around the time that I reached 1 million reputation. Stack Overflow flew me and my whole family to New York. We had a week in New York. It was wonderful. And we had a series of recordings and a podcast and stuff. It was great fun. So yes, they definitely listen, but at the same time, if you look on Stack Overflow, you'll see I asked a question saying, is the rep cap, the rep cap has basically been the same since day one. It's 200 points from votes, and if you get an accepted answer, that's worth 15 and doesn't count towards the rep cap for the day. And there was a brief period in late 2008 where they said, oh, that bit about accepted answers not counting towards the rep cap, that was a bug. We should take that away. And there was revolution, and so they restored it, because otherwise no one could ever catch up, because everyone would be stuck on 200 a day forever as a maximum. And even now, when I don't post very much, I still mostly get 200 a day. And that Stack Overflow post had lots of people disagreeing with it, including Jeff. I don't think Joel posted about it, but would probably have disagreed. I still think it makes me suspicious anytime that the rule on day one happens to be right 15 years later. It feels like, that's a bit of a coincidence. Are we sure that 200 rather than 150 or 250 is correct? How about reputation declining over time, this sort of thing? So I would say, if I voice an opinion either to Stack Overflow devs or Stack Overflow leadership, it's not like I'm regularly in touch with them. But I think if I reached out, they would listen, and they would feel free to respectfully disagree. And I wouldn't have it any other way. The day that I say, well, if you're not going to do what I want, then I'm off, and flounce off in a huff and delete all my content, that day will never come. I could say, if Stack Overflow took some kind of political position that was so contrary to my own views that I just could not contribute to the site ever again, then I could walk away, but I wouldn't start deleting my content. And I hope it wouldn't be a case of me holding it to ransom. I would express my views, but not in a do it or else. It may well be, well, if this doesn't change, we will have to part company. But that isn't a threat as a, well, because I'm me, I get my own way. No.
I got it.
So there is a balance of a certain amount of, it's easier to get attention, but then I think, and I would hope that they would recognize a certain amount of experience here. If I make a comment about something not being helpful in the site's user interface, then as someone who has spent tens of thousands of hours on the site, that should have a bit more weight than someone who's just arrived. In some cases, just the opposite. Like something that I've got used to and don't notice anymore, but is immediately a friction point to someone who's new. Listen to the newbie. They've got the fresh information there.
What would you say for someone that is starting to develop their coding skills, their programming skills, they feel a bit intimidated in being more active in the, in the Stack Overflow community. How do you recommend they break this initial barrier of, okay, let me give this a try, let me see if I can contribute here?
So, two things. Firstly, I would say read my guide to writing a good question. I put a lot of time into that, and I stand by it. And one of the main points in it is read what you've written. Look at and that includes the form of the post as well as the function, as it were. So, is it formatted well? And again, this isn't a matter of looking for perfection, but if you've got badly formatted code that show you haven't been to the help, it's quite easy to format code quite well on Stack Overflow. Just put 3 backticks and then something indicating the language, copy paste your code, and then put 3 backticks at the end, and it will be okay. Now, okay isn't necessarily as good as it can be. So if you've just copied that from Visual Studio and you're within a namespace declaration and then a class declaration and then a method declaration, so you've got 12 spaces before every line of code and you haven't included any of those declarations, well then, hey, maybe shift things out a bit first. And maybe that's it. Personally, I do that in Visual Studio. I select, hit Shift Tab until it's all lined up on the left, copy paste it into Stack Overflow, and then undo it in Visual Studio. There are other ways of doing it, but that's the way I find easiest. But have a look at your post and say, if I were someone coming to answer that post, is that how I would want it to look? Does it give me all the information I would expect to see? Like saying, I've tried this code and I get a compile time error. Right, well, what's the obvious thing that everyone's going to ask? What was the error?
What was there, exactly?
You don't need to be the world's smartest person, which I'm certainly not, to recognize that that's a missing bit of information. So go over your post and just spend a bit of time saying, does it have all the information that someone needs? Without going into, well, yesterday I started writing this code and then someone came to the door and turns out they were delivering pizza, but it wasn't pizza for me, it was pizza for the person next door. None of that's relevant. So keep it to relevant information, but all the relevant information that can be needed. And you won't always know that, but give it your best shot.
What if I want to answer questions, to be on the other side of the equation?
That's great. Firstly, don't be intimidated. You mentioned the word intimidated earlier on. Certainly don't be intimidated by there being other people who may know more than you. That doesn't stop you from knowing the answer to this one question at all. I would make sure it's relevant to the question being asked. And so don't use answers to actually ask for more information, for example. That's for comments. And you may not have enough reputation to ask for more information. That's not a reason to use answers for comments. You just wait for someone else to ask. Ideally, and this is where if the person asking the question has given a short but complete program, then you can have copied that, reproduced the problem, fixed it, and then you know that it's fixed because you've run the code yourself. I'm a lot better. One of the skills that you learn on Stack Overflow, if you're not, I realize I'm giving mixed signals here, but I don't always test the code that I write on Stack Overflow. I will often write code out and be pretty confident that it will just work. And that's a skill that you learn when answering questions. You learn to be able to do, and this is useful in whiteboard interviews, however ghastly they may be, being able to just come out with code that will work and you can be confident in is a real benefit in your career. But yes, where possible, test that it does work, but then explain why it works. Explain what was wrong. Ideally, think of it like a story. Okay, your starting point is this code. Here's why it doesn't work, and maybe you're teaching during that. Here's how you can fix it. Here's the code with it fixed. and maybe at the bottom, and by the way, you could make all this much more efficient if you use that thing over there instead. But you're still, that's an extra bit of cherry on the cake. You don't just write an answer saying, don't do that, do this instead. It's all try to put yourself in the shoes of the person asking the question and say, is this actually going to be helpful to them? Is this going to be what they want to read? Sometimes it won't be what they want to read because they've said, I've got some XML that isn't quite valid XML. What should I do? And the answer is, you should go back to wherever you got that XML from and get actual XML instead. And I'm sure you want me to just fix it up a bit, but actually there are so many problems doing that it's better to just go back to the source that was broken to start with.
Awesome. Jon, I again, being cognizant of your time,
Yes.
there is I'd like to ask you, how did being part of Stack Overflow as a member, as a community member, how did that change your life?
So it's changed my life specifically more than I'm sure anyone else other than people whose careers were at Stack Overflow, because of actually I'm wrong on that, and I'll explain why in a sec. But because I have been given special treatment. I have a unicorn painting from when I got to 100,000 rep. I was flown to the US. This doesn't happen to everyone. But things in common with other people are improving my communication skills, becoming better known. So we might not be talking today if it weren't for Stack Overflow. It's hard to disentangle other things that I've been doing. Would I have been well known for conferences, which, I've spoken at plenty of conferences, but I might not have had those opportunities if it weren't for Stack Overflow. It's all sort of interweaved. So it's made a difference to me in somewhat unique ways, but also the gaining skills, getting answers. I've mentioned hundreds of times I've looked on Stack Overflow for answers. Anytime I do anything with a shell script or a Perl script or Python, I'm always on Stack Overflow for that. And that's where actually there probably are people whose lives have been changed more radically because Stack Overflow helped get them their first job, and that has transformed their life in amazing ways and stuff. So I guess that's a different kind of transformation. But yeah, the benefits in terms of just improving communication and being conscious of that, being conscious of the value of communication, and that ideas themselves, having an idea that's really useful, or having the knowledge of here's the method that you want to call, or the weird way in which that doesn't work, that's only part of the story. Communicating it effectively, both in terms of what words you use and how you present those words, those are all part of a bigger whole. And when you hit the sweet spot of getting it all right, it's a lovely feeling and people appreciate it.
I can tell you that with your almost 40,000 answers that you have done, you have plenty of karma credits there for a few lifetimes, Jon, okay, so to wrap things up, I'm gonna just pick your brain on something very current everybody's talking about. I'm sure that you may have explored that a little bit, and I would like to get your perspective, if you have any, to share about ChatGPT in our profession,
Right.
As a developer, as a coder. How do you see things unfold from here?
It definitely has potential. I don't think it's going to be putting people out of business. I've read various blog posts either saying, "Oh, it's going to kill Google search." No, it's not. It's going to kill our industry. Engineers will become redundant. No. It will be useful for helping us solve problems to some extent. The problem at the moment is it's miraculous in terms of you ask a question and get a beautiful sounding, very persuasive answer out. You're still going to find out whether or not that's right. And on Stack Overflow, there are plenty of times where people give the wrong answers. I have done so myself on more than one occasion, for which I am sorry. I'm just as human as everyone else. I make mistakes. often on Stack Overflow, wrong answers are fairly obviously wrong. And there are some hidden signals around, this person is expressing themselves really badly. And, sometimes great people with fantastic amounts of knowledge do express themselves badly, but often you can just tell that something's a bit off, and maybe they have got the right answer. It's worth checking, but you're skeptical. ChatGPT, you get the same degree of confidence, whether it's right or wrong, which means that there aren't as many extra signals. So you do need to spend extra time validating it. And it's probably only it's not generating the ideas. You could probably find that answer somewhere on Stack Overflow, or at least the answers that it's derived that from. And it will always be a couple of years behind. My guess is if you ask ChatGPT about the absolute latest and greatest things in .NET or whatever, then it won't know, because all it's doing is it's recycling information that other people have written down. So aside from anything else, there's a sort of negative feedback loop there. If everyone only ever used ChatGPT and no one wrote anything, then in 5 years' time, it would be completely useless, because it would have no new information about the latest frameworks and things. So I do think it will be useful. I think it's hard to predict exactly what those uses will be, but I'm also not personally worried. Partly, I'm hoping to retire in 15 years, if not before. I'm pretty sure it won't have replaced me before I retire anyway.
That's a good one. That's a good one. A good way to think about it. Jon, thanks so much for our time. There are so many other points that we could explore. I mean, I would be super curious about why your obsession. Don't answer this. Let's leave it for another time. But your obsession about date time. What is it about date time that you have? You seem to have an obsession about that. But anyway, date time, and talking about your books, and talking about Google, and talking about C# again. So many other things that we could be talking about. Our conversation today, we try to focus more on the Stack Overflow side of things. So I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for being this open, this friendly. And I once this is live, once this is done, finished, I will submit to you so you can have a look and you can give your blessing as well, okay?
I'm sure it'll be absolutely fine. But yes,
perfect, Jon. Again, thanks so much. And again, I'll follow up with some links after that, okay?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fabulous.
And okay. I will search that post that you said that you had
That's
about
fine.
how to write. I'll search it. I'll find it. That's fine.
I can post it. I've got a tiny URL link for it, so it's really easy for it.
Perfect.
There we go.
Awesome. Again, Jon, have a good night. Thank you so much for your time. Okay.
My pleasure. Let's do it again sometime.
Let's do it. Thank you, Jon.
Okay.
Bye.